Some people say save the best for the last, or those that still hang in here to hear what we have to say. But my job is to keep you all awake. And yeah, I'll do that. People that know me. I'm also come from Saskatchewan, but I recently moved to Alberta, and this is a shot from the beautiful land of the living skies in Saskatchewan, where we get a lot of wind. And I've been told that I speak with wind speeds of up to 300 miles per hour, almost as fast as the people from Newfoundland. So the people from Newfoundland will definitely understand me. But I really am excited to share this presentation. It's a new one. It took me forever to do, and it was a late night to try and get it finally finished. Because in this session, before I give the CCA amazing survey results from our labeling, I just want to, I know Michael and Misu have done some of the explanation about regs, but I think it's important that we do it again just briefly and have it in words so that it will put some context into what I'm going to say about the survey results. So just as a reminder for those of you who've been around as long as I have, it took us 14 years of advocacy work by the CCA, allergy associations, and other groups, including our own Marian Zarkatis, dietitian, who was a long-standing member of the PAC, who was instrumental in starting this process to realize that the current food and drug regulations at the time had a lot of loopholes where gluten and allergen sources could be there, but were not required to be declared. So after 14 long years, in 2011, these regulations, we all call them 1220, the enhanced labeling regulations for food allergens and gluten sources and added sulfites was passed, and it came into force in 2012. Now the list, just to remind you of what was considered priority allergens and the definition of gluten. And you can see wheat, or triticale, was one of those allergens. And then the definition of gluten was barley, rye, wheat, triticale, oats, or any gluten protein, modified gluten protein, or gluten protein fraction from any of those above cereals. And we'll talk a little bit, Michael mentioned about the exemption for oats, which I'll touch on again too, just to remind you. So those were the rules, meaning that any packaged food would have to declare these allergens and gluten sources, which is an amazing feat that we got through. And to remind you too is that the way a manufacturer will have to declare any of those allergen or gluten sources, it either has to be listed in the ingredient list by its plain common name. So for example, casein, people wouldn't know that that would be milk, so it would have to be declared as such. Or if they don't list it in the ingredient list, they have to list it in the contain statement. And that's important to remember, and a lot of people are confused about contains and may contains, which I'll talk about in a few moments. Now, at the same time that 1220 enhanced labeling regulations were passed, the gluten-free regulation, which we had since 1995, so we were ahead of the US, we've had that regulation, it was revised, and this is the new wording that had to go at the same time that we passed 1220. And as Michael reminded us, and Mishu, that you cannot label, package, sell, or advertise in a food in a manner to create the impression that it's gluten-free if it contains any gluten protein, modified gluten protein, etc. So that just kind of puts things in term. And again, gluten, the definition of gluten-containing grains were the ones that we have there. And you'll note that, as Michael said, oats was in the list. And why we really struggled for many years at the CCA and working with Health Canada and Agriculture, Agri-Foods, was what do we do about oats? If we take oats out of the definition of gluten, like they did in the States, then it's kind of a free-for-all. You really don't know if those oats were gluten-free or they were the regular contaminated. So Health Canada kept oats in there. And then we worked later to get that changed. And so the regs, as Michael said, you can refer to all of these. If you go to the Health Canada website, you can read Health Canada's position in detail on gluten-free claims. Now, we started this process back in 2003 on the CCA and realized on the Professional Advisory Board that oats were not so much the problem, the protein in oats causing the issue. It was the fact that they were highly contaminated. And so for many years, since 2003 up until 2015, it took us 12 years, things move slow to change, to come up with a regulatory solution with Health Canada to allow pure uncontaminated oats to be labeled as gluten-free, because the literature had shown that the vast majority of people with celiac disease could consume pure uncontaminated oats. So how we got around that, Dr. Sammy Godefroy at the time, who was Director General of Health Canada, came up with the minister to come up with a marketing authorization. And Michael reminded us what a marketing authorization, unlike regulations that take a long time to go through hoops to get passed, is that they could exempt something out of existing regulations. So we could take oats and leave it in as the definition of gluten, but if they were specially processed, they could be, and under 20 parts, they could be called gluten-free oats, and they have to be clearly identified as gluten-free oats. So if you just see oats in the ingredient list in a Canadian product on the shelf, anything labeled in Canada, that means it is not gluten-free unless you see the words gluten-free oats. So that is different than the US. They don't have to declare it as gluten-free oats in the ingredient list. Now, what Health Canada didn't do at the time, though, was to specify the methods or controls that should be used to produce those gluten-free oats. And that's why we're having some challenges, because we now have more people jumping into the gluten-free bandwagon, more manufacturers producing products with so-called gluten-free oats. And as Margaret alluded from Avena, the challenge is to determine, can you make sure that all those wheat, rye, and barley kernels are out of oats? And I'll tell you, on the prairies of the Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, where most of the oats are grown for North America, is that barley is the #1 thing that tends to be commingled with, and sometimes wheat, with those oats. And one of the challenges when you're doing an optical mechanical sort is that barley groats are almost identical in size, shape, and color as an oat groat. So that means you're counting on the equipment to kick out the gluten-containing grains this way and the gluten-free oats that way. And so that's where there is some concern. We feel strongly on the PAC that we support purity protocol oats. There's been enough research in that to show that. And now we have more manufacturers coming in with mechanically optical sorted. So there's a bit of a still concern, and we are hearing some people saying they are getting sick from oats, and so we have to wonder, is this due to the way the oats are being processed, and also the whole testing. And Quaker has clearly shown how difficult and how much testing you have to do to look for those hot spots, because they're not equally distributed. So as Margaret had mentioned, and others, about lot sizes, how big does that lot size need to be to make sure that you've found where's Waldo? Okay, so that's sort of a crash course on the gluten-free and the allergen. So I want to talk now about allergen-free claims. As Misu mentioned, the CFIA and Health Canada have guidelines on their websites, and I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I just want to remind you when a manufacturer, because this is important when we look at free-froms and made-contains and that, is that the allergen-free claim is a negative statement or a claim pertaining to the absence of a food allergen source. So for example, peanut-free, soy-free, no wheat. And there should be absolutely no amount of the named food allergen source in the product, whether it was added intentionally, which it shouldn't be, or cross-contamination and inadvertent. Now, Health Canada and the CFIA have guidelines for precautionary statements. This is guidelines online 2012. And there are different components of these precautionary statements, and I'll just give you some key points about it. The intention is to alert consumers of the possible inadvertent presence of the allergen. The key here is it's on a voluntary basis. The manufacturers are not required to, but they can make a choice to do that. And as Michael said, they must be truthful and not misleading, and not a substitute for good manufacturing processes. So that's practices. That's the ideal. Now, the other thing is they only should be used when, as Michael said, despite all reasonable measures, the inadvertent presence of the allergens in foods is unavoidable. But on the flip side, the use of these statements when there's really no risk of having the allergen present is contrary to their goals. And that's where I believe is our biggest challenge, as Michael pointed out earlier, is when is there a real risk and when is there a risk that they're just the CYA, and I won't say the A word, but it's cover your butts from a lawsuit, and the overuse of them. So food allergen precautionary statements, the regulation recent update in 2016 that will come into force on 2021 will require these precautionary warning statements like may contains immediately following the list of ingredients and the contain statement if they use a contain statement. Now there is no regulation for their specific wording or what the statement has to say. And Health Canada recommends, and this is the key, they recommended only one precautionary statement be used, and that is may contain. But this is not what's really happening in practice. And this is where it really gets confusing. So now, allergen claims with a precautionary statement, how does that work? So it's not acceptable that you could label a product wheat-free and may contain wheat. It's an oxymoron. You can't, it's either one or the other. So they will not allow a may contain wheat or a may contain allergen on the same allergen-free claim. That makes sense. But there's exceptions. And it says that when other types of precautionary statements, such as wheat-free, but processed in a facility that also processes wheat, or produced in a facility that also processes wheat, would be allowed, and the manufacturer must ensure, though, that the allergen-free claim is accurate. So let's just go back and remember that, if I can get this back, it doesn't look like it can go on a back on here. Oh, did you? Okay. Yes, Health Canada only recommends one claim, but on this other hand, they are allowing, whoops, gone to, can you take one back for me? Thank you. But they will allow that statement processed in a facility. So it's a little bit confusing with that. And if it doesn't get more confusing, then we go to gluten-free claim and it may contain wheat. And Health Canada says they are allowed to have a gluten-free claim and it may contain wheat, but it should be done with caution. It's really there to alert the wheat allergic consumer that there could be potentially low levels of the wheat protein in that gluten-free food. And the claim is truthful as long as the gluten-free product is under the 20 parts per million. And I noticed online it says they encourage to use the words may contain less than 20 parts per million of wheat. I haven't seen this on any packages so far, and I might have missed some of them, but to date I have not seen anybody use that term. I just see the gluten-free and then some variation of a may contain wheat or made in a facility with wheat. So it is a little bit confusing for people with celiac. So I can tell you I'm a dietitian. I've been working in celiac forever. I've been on the PAC since 1995, so I've been around a long time, which means I'm old. And I can tell you that the gluten-free claim with a may contain wheat or other wheat, rye, or barley precautionary statement is terribly confusing, and it's a common question I get from consumers. And I will share with you in our survey, but people do not like this, and I can see why. So what I thought I would do is highlight a few aspects of gluten-free claims that I feel we need to address. So, and I think many of you might agree with me. In order for a product to be considered a gluten-free claim, it has to be complying with the section B.24.018. I can sing that one in my sleep, B.24.018, because I've known it for a long time. But one of the challenges is in the interpretation of what foods and products are actually permitted to use that claim. And it's quite obvious when we look at things like gluten-free cookies and muffins and pasta and cereal, they obviously have to be made from alternatives to wheat, rye, and barley. So that one's a pretty simple one. So if somebody made gluten-free pasta or gluten-free cookies, no problem. It should be able to make a gluten-free claim if it's less than 20 parts per million. However, not so simple when it comes to other things, and that's where we were having this discussion about rice. And this came to my attention because people, dietitians and consumers, were emailing me saying, did you know that Lundberg used to have a gluten-free claim on rice, and now they've been told to take it off? Now it's still on there. These were recent packages that I went to the store and bought. And so you can see there's several brands of rice that have the gluten-free claim. The quinoa has the gluten-free claim. The rice pasta or vermicelli has the gluten-free claim. So I think, Michael and Misu, that's where we really do need some more help from Health Canada and the interpretation of how CFI inspectors are taking this declaration of foods that have been specially processed. And we just had a big discussion, and so you can see it is a bone of contention, and I'm not sure we've got that clarified. But on the other hand, what we don't want is a bottle of water that has a gluten-free claim, and I've seen that. And so what it does two things there. So when you pick up this bottle of water, and there's 3 brands in front of you, and you see one with a gluten-free claim, and you're new to celiac, and then you see the other 2, it implies that there must be maybe gluten in those other 2, and this one is the safer one, and this one probably is the more expensive one. So, yeah, no, because it was back there. So I think it's a balancing act, Michael, and I understand it's not easy for you folks and CFIA, because we've had this discussion for years about what if we open the floodgates to let everybody and their dog put gluten-free on there. Sometimes it's a marketing schlick and a way to charge more. But on the other hand, we do need to know whether ingredients like this and single ingredients are safe and gluten-free. So the other thing that you need to be aware of in the gluten-free regulation is there is no, in the regulation, there is no specific threshold level. So they haven't written it into the regulations, but the guidance document says that Health Canada considers levels of gluten protein under 20 parts per million generally do not represent a health risk for consumers with celiac disease. Now, in talking to patients, talking to dietitians and others, many feel that this level should be lowered, and they don't even want any detectable gluten. And this could be an interesting table discussion that I'll throw out to you when I'm done, because I would like to know where people feel on that. The other thing is that consumers also have expressed that they want products with a gluten-free claim to be made in dedicated gluten-free facilities. They say if it's got a gluten-free claim, it should be coming out of a place where only gluten-free products are there. So kind of interesting where we're at there. So that is sort of just the preamble to now, what did all the people that filled our survey out, which I'm amazed at the response. So now that you've got that overview and sort of set the stage, you kind of can keep things into perspective. So what did we do? Well, we put out an online survey. We wanted to find out from people what was their confidence in existing labels and what did they understand about contains, may contains, when you have a gluten-free claim and a may contain, or you don't have a gluten-free claim and a may contain. How did they make decisions? And we looked at 4 groups of people when they filled the survey out. We asked, were you diagnosed with celiac disease who are following a gluten-free diet? Are you not officially diagnosed with celiac, but you're on a gluten-free diet? Then we asked if you were a parent or a caregiver of someone with celiac disease on a gluten-free diet. And then also we were trying to get some feedback from dietitians. Amazingly, we put the survey out and there was a glitch in the survey, and we had like, I don't know, was it 1,500 people? 1,500 people in 12 hours. I mean, the celiac community is brand loyal to doing things about labeling. And so we had to redo the survey and send it out. And we still did amazingly well. And we asked people that had taken it before, please redo it. And those that haven't, please jump on the bandwagon and get it done. We advertised it through social media on the CCA's Facebook page of 11,000 people, other Facebook pages, Twitter. We did a blast to our members, but press releases, the CCA website, and others. So for example, I blasted it out to a lot of my colleagues and friends and people in the gluten-free world. So it wasn't just people with celiac disease. And so if you look here, we received the bulk of our responses were from diagnosed people with celiac. So that's actually pretty good when you're doing surveys. We really don't want so much the gluten-free adopters. We're looking for the people that depend on the gluten-free diet for their health. And so 78% of the 2,346 people, amazing in a week, that filled this survey out. We had a few that were 6% that weren't officially diagnosed, 15% caregivers, and only 1%. We didn't get too many dietitians, and we need to get this out in a different way to more dietitians because we'd like to find out what they're telling patients. So you probably feel like these 2 mice. Personally, I wouldn't touch anything without first looking at the list of ingredients. You know, celiac consumers are what I would call one of the most savviest groups of consumers because it depends on your health by knowing what's in the food. So now what we did is we worded the questions. So for example, because we wanted the same questions being asked of the dietitians, the caregivers, and of the people. So the wording was just, what happened is if you clicked the first question and you said you were a consumer with celiac or you were following a gluten-free diet but undiagnosed or a caregiver, or the first 2, we asked, do you consume, in this question, products with a precautionary statement on the label? If it was for the dietitians, it was the same question, but just worded, could a person with celiac disease consume products with a precautionary statement on the label? So we were comparing the same type of answer, just had to word it as such so that it would make sense. And we wanted to get the pulse of what dietitians were thinking and what they might say to a patient that they were dealing with. So interesting. When we asked this question, we just didn't do a general, we split it up because we wanted to see, were there differences in the type of precautionary statement? So we asked may contain wheat, and you can see that the vast majority would not touch a gluten or a product that had any kind of precautionary statement. About 19% said, though, it would depend on the type of product. So it might be something like, for example, if it was me, I'd be looking at if it was a grain or a flour. It might depend on that. Made on shared equipment was equally scary to a lot of people. They really didn't like that. 81% said they wouldn't consume it, and 15% said maybe depending on the product. Now, interesting, if it was made in a facility that processes wheat, only about 57%, about half, said they wouldn't touch it. So they have a little bit more confidence in the facility because they recognize, well, it's not on the same processing line. It might be on the other end of the plant. The plant could be divided in half. So there seemed to be a little bit of a difference there. And about a third of the people said it really depended on the product. Now, we asked a specific question now about if it had some kind of precautionary statement, like may contain wheat, made in a facility that contains wheat, something to do with a precautionary warning about wheat, but it also had a gluten-free claim. And you can see people were not touching it. 65% said, no, that is not a good thing to have a gluten-free product with a may contain wheat. 21% said it depended on the type of product. Now, well, I will just remind you in the bottom there, I just put this back again. Health Canada and CFIA will permit both of these claims. A may contain precautionary warning about wheat in a gluten-free product, as long as it's less than 20. But most of the respondents were not feeling very comfortable when you see gluten-free and a may contain. Now we went to a different group of questions, and we said, okay, there's no gluten-free claim on the label, but when you read the ingredients, you don't see any gluten. It looks safe, good to me. I mean, there's no claim there, but we don't see anything on the label that would alert me in the contain statement or the ingredients. But there was a precautionary statement. And what we did is we went through different groups of foods to see, was there a difference in the categories of foods that people might be a little bit more concerned about. And so we started out with the grains. And you can see that I got these survey results just like less than a week ago, so it was a really mad crash course to get this together. The survey company gave me the yes answers. I would have been happier to see the no because it would have been easier because you'd have shown those numbers were bigger. But it does show you that very few people would touch grains, at least not oats. So they're up to speed on oats, knowing that's not a good idea if there's a may contain on oats. So they were up to speed there. They wouldn't touch some of those other grains, but you can see their confidence level on rice and wild rice. They would maybe consume it more so than those other grains. And possibly the reason why is that people perceive that rice and wild rice are not as risky because they're grown, as Lisa said, in water, you know. So what about flours? Same question, no gluten claim on there, no gluten-free claim, no gluten-containing ingredients anywhere, but there was a may contain wheat or some other statement about wheat. And once again, it shows that people were aware that oats are not too safe when you see a may contain wheat on the oat flour. The majority of people recognize that many of these grains would be problematic. So that just kind of gives you a snapshot there. But interesting, let's look at pulses. No gluten-free claim, no gluten-containing ingredients, but there's a may contain wheat or some other wheat warning. More people, the numbers went up, that they would consume pulses even with a may contain wheat, although 75% still would not touch it. But it is interesting just to see a little bit of the differences there. What about seeds? Same thing, a little bit all over, but interesting that hemp, we know from research that hemp is very prone to being cross-contaminated with wheat. So this is one that is an issue that we need to pay attention to. Okay, then we just gave them a group of options of different categories of food. Same thing, there was no gluten-free claim, but you looked at the packaged product of nuts or cereals or crackers, and you only saw a may contain warning, or made in a facility with wheat or made on shared equipment. And you can see people, 21% said yes to the nuts, but where the cereals, crackers, and snack foods, they were a little more cautious, and the soups. But still, may contain, there's a trend here. People are not liking precautionary statements. So now we're going to switch to the next question where there was no may contain warning. So you're picking up a package of foods, and you didn't see a gluten-free claim, but there's no may contains, no statements, anything. It's just nuts or some type of spices. And look at how people's confidence level went up when there was no warnings, and they're up, almost and 77 to 90%, especially with rice and wild rice. So they weren't as worried. Same thing with pulses. Interesting, they would consume pulses if there was no warning about wheat, even though there was no claim. But let me remind you, though, when we asked people if there was a may contain, look at the difference. If there was a may contain on pulses, not that many would consume it, but if there was nothing, no warning, they would. Now here's an example of a problem. So this one has actually gluten-free certification on it for lentils. So there's no warnings, there's no may contains, and it's even certified. And Tricia Thompson with Gluten Free Watchdog in the States tested that, and you can see that they're at 78 to 80, greater than 84 parts per million. So lentils, as Margaret commented about a purity protocol lentil, we really do need to see some safe pulses on the market, because lentils in Saskatchewan particularly, we grow about 90% of Canada's lentils, and farmers usually rotate their crops. So 1 year it might be wheat, the next year it could be lentils, canola, flax, and so that rotation or barley can be there. And you can see the visible, this came out of the package of the product, and there were all kinds of interesting looking gluten-containing grains in that product. These were supposed to be lentils, and that was in the bag of certified gluten-free lentils. Yes. So there was an oops somewhere, but going back, as my point is that, interesting that people had a high level of confidence on products that didn't have a may contain, and then when there was you even got a certified product, and you can see that there's issues. So we really have work to do. I know Paul talked about the version 3 of the standard, and I think we still have to do some more work in the whole area of the supply chain from the farm to the manufacturer. And we've worked hard on the oats, but we've got more work to do with these other commodity ingredients. And here's just something to show you. Where's Waldo? This is my hand, and one nice little kernel of a grain that's not supposed to be there, and those are lentils, and that came from a farmer that's a very good farmer. He has good cleaning operations, and he gave me his sack of lentils, and I always put them on a cookie sheet and do a visual inspection, and I will inevitably find the odd stray barley or wheat kernel kicking in there. So this is fine for people that when you can just buy packaged lentils or pulses, you can put them on the cookie sheet and inspect them. But the problem is, you can't inspect lentil flour or chickpea flour that's gone into a pasta. And so where there's smoke, there can be fire. Now, we asked about grains when there was no gluten claim or no gluten-free grain. And again, more people would consume those if they didn't see a precautionary labeling. But there are a third of the people know maybe oats aren't such a good, or 2/3 think oats is not good. I'm surprised that even a third of the people would eat them without a gluten-free claim. So we still have some work to do. And the rice and wild rice and the confidence level seemed to be much higher. And when we looked at flours, similar pattern for the flours as the grains, about who would consume a product, much higher than if there was no may contain. But here's the problem. Health Canada, Michael's team with Terry Corner at Health Canada did a study back in 2013. And we know we've thoroughly studied oats. Now, this study had not done oats because they had done a previous study on the contamination level of oats, which was very high. But Health Canada looked at these naturally gluten-free flours and starches, and they analyzed the products, and you can see the range was anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 parts per million, and about 10% of the samples were over 20 parts per million. The good news is at least products that had the gluten-free claim, there were very few that were contaminated. But if there was no statement, so it's just the ingredients on there, that about 10% of them were contaminated. And in this study, almost 38%, if they had a warning, were contaminated. Now, there's been some other studies that have found the exact opposite. The ones that had the may contains rarely were contaminated, but as Michael alluded to, it really can depend on, you know, the sampling program. So what's the advice that we give people? Is that they should choose naturally gluten-free grains, flours, starches, and your baked products that have a gluten-free claim and or are certified. That's your general best practices. And we want to buy from companies, like we heard this morning, from Enjoy Life and Kinnikinnick, as well as companies like Sharon and Promise. They have good manufacturing practices with rigid quality control, and they're testing their incoming ingredients and their final products. So that is critical. But don't you feel like these two people here? It's time to play gluten roulette, because it can be terribly confusing. So one of the things that I had is, if it wasn't bad enough to analyze those 2,346 surveys, people actually, we had one open-ended question, scary stuff in research. But it was very enlightening, because what happened is we had 845 comments at the end of the survey. That's 36% of the respondents told us what they thought and more information. So I read through on the plane to Minneapolis and back last weekend speaking, and 3 days of work to try and summarize these survey statements. And they fell along the lines of what people thought about may contains and other precautionary statements, what they thought about the may contain and the gluten-free claim, what about products that had a gluten-free claim versus not having a gluten-free claim, what they thought about GFCP and other certifications, what about gluten-free claims in restaurants and other food services, gluten-free foods in long-term care and institutions, gluten in meds and over-the-counter products, the cost of gluten-free foods, tax exemption of gluten-free foods, medications that would help in celiac so we wouldn't have to follow this crazy gluten-free diet. And they thanked the CCA, which was very rewarding. I told Melissa when she has some free time, she should read all the comments about how wonderful people thought CCA was, and they were grateful for the improved labeling and advocating for improved labeling and food safety standards. Now, I don't have time. I've already run out of time, but I'm going to go through really quickly just so you get a snapshot of what people thought. Bottom line is may contain some precautionary statements. They're confusing, they're very frustrated, and it's super controversial. And some people were even confused about the difference between contains and may contain, so we have more education. And many do not consider, this is a key one, may contain is not the same as made in a shared facility with wheat and made on shared equipment with wheat. People are treating, as you saw on a little bit of our preliminary numbers, that they are treating different statements with different levels of risk. And a lot of people are frustrated that they're spending so much time calling companies, asking about ingredients, manufacturing processes, testing, labeling statements to figure out if this is okay. And here's one. I asked, Linda sent out a note on Facebook, and within about 24 hours, we asked people, send Shelley the most confusing labels you've ever seen, and frustration. I got a boatload, but I'm not going to show them all to you. But just here's an example. It says gluten-free oat flour, so they've labeled it properly. But then they go, under the contains, it's sesame seeds, milk, and pure oats, but the may contains nuts and traces of wheat. So they said, what is that? Another one said, here's one that's got the gluten-free claim on the front of package, and then on the right side there it says, manufactured in a facility that also processes wheat, egg, peanut, crustacean, shellfish, tree nuts, and milk. So people are confused there. Here's another one, organic. A lot of people think organic's healthier, better, but then there's no claim, there's nothing in the ingredient other quinoa, but again, may contain traces of gluten, wheat, and mustard. This one takes the cake. This one has, in the contain statement, it says wheat, but I can't see anything in the ingredients that would have wheat. But then they've got 2 asterisks, and then they say, traces amounts are unavoidable in field grains. Oats used in this product are certified gluten-free. So the person said, so what do I do with that? Another one, a gluten-free claim, and it's gluten-free certified, made in a facility of wheat, but at least they go to the trouble of telling us that they are testing for gluten, so that's a step up there, so that helps. The other thing that people did not like was these may contain and precautionary statements, is that they say they spend way too much time trying to figure out, they got so many things to look at. Ingredients, may contains, other warnings, certification, claims. It's like taking them forever. And a lot of people, this was the #1 comment I saw. They were strongly feeling that companies were overusing the may contains and precautionary as a liability protection and not the real level of risk. That was their perception in their comments, most commonly. And they felt that there's a proliferation of warning statements and that many people are having to needlessly avoid products because of all these claims, and they want better regulations. So I'm glad Michael, the Codex, is going to look at this, but I imagine this is a mighty big task, and it could take a while. So just to throw a little confusion and have a little fun at the end of a Friday afternoon, and you're all just staying awake with me, I can see. Maybe not. Here's Himalayan pink sea salt. Or pink salt, but there's a may contain wheat. Bay leaves may contain wheat. So people are wondering. Now, Walmart is notorious for over-labeling everything, and people sent me all of those, and they all have so many may contains on other foods. Here's, where's the next one? This was another thing that people are having trouble finding are certain categories of foods without a may contain warning, and that's nuts and seeds and pulses. It's very difficult to find that. Here's some popcorn that has may contain wheat in there. The other thing people were frustrated with, as I mentioned before, is this may contain wheat with a gluten-free claim. I'd say that's probably one of the big ones that people are really frustrated with. Many didn't even realize this was allowed. How can this be? How can Health Canada be allowing this? Is it gluten-free or is it not? Very confused. They had difficulty determining if there was a risk. And Paul, for your information, what they said about certification, GFCP or others, that products that have the GFCP claim on the front or some certification should not allow any products with may contain. Do we? No. Good. But I'm not so sure all certifying bodies follow that same rules. So that's something to know. So here's one where we've got the gluten-free claim on front of pack, up at the top left, as well as in the middle, the bottom. And then this product, it is packaged using machines that may have come in contact with wheat and gluten, et cetera, et cetera. Now here's a little stepping up a bit better. Here's an example of a gluten-free claim product, but they tell you it's made in a facility where there is wheat and dairy, et cetera, but at least they're testing the ELISA method to less than 20 parts. So we've got a little bit more information on that one. The other thing people were frustrated was it was trying to decide about the whole issue about would I buy products that don't have gluten-free claims versus those that do. Many will only buy products with the gluten-free claim, and if they have two similar products, one with the claim and one without, they definitely go with the gluten-free. Many people want more products, so they want the rice and they want these other things, single ingredients, with a gluten-free claim, and they want all products that do not contain gluten to have a claim. That would be interesting, then we'd have apples and all. So just to say, and kind of wrapping up here quickly, here's an example for, Joel's not here, but Enjoy Life, you can see on the top, on the left over there, it says Purity Protocol gluten-free oats. So the consumer knows right away that it's what type of oats these are. And you can see on the back, in the middle one, it says made in a dedicated and gluten-free facility. So people are having more information. There's SHAR, they're making the dairy-free and the wheat-free claim. So that helps people figure it out. Now, products with a gluten-free claim versus a no claim again, many people said they don't trust the gluten-free claim, so they still have to call companies. And that's sad because the whole reason why we have gluten-free claims is hopefully to make it easier for people. A lot of people want a lower threshold level. They want to go like Australia to no detectable, and they also want the same standards. If it's peanut-free, there's no peanuts. Gluten-free should be the same thing. There should be no gluten. And many people look on the packages for the certification symbols, especially GFCP. And many will only buy certified gluten-free products because it makes their life so much easier and they can trust the symbol and the product is safe. And they'd like to see more child-friendly gluten-free certified products. So here's just a few examples: Only Oats, the Clubhouse Spices, Catelli Pasta, and the Compliments brand with our gluten-free certification logo. Same logo in the blue at the bottom is Canada. If you see it green in the US, that is the Beyond Celiac that uses the same. There are other certification bodies that are also doing gluten-free certification. People only want products made in dedicated gluten-free facilities to be allowed to carry the symbol. They do not want gluten-free certified products coming out of a shared facility. And the comment was made this morning about certification is expensive and it's tough for smaller companies to afford that. And they felt like certified products often are more expensive than non-certified. So in conclusion, sort of just wrapping up, that under the general comments, people are really frustrated with the answers that they get from companies saying, we don't know if our suppliers, the ingredients might have been cross-contaminated, so we can't make a gluten-free claim. There might be a risk, so we can't guarantee it's gluten-free. And the other thing we're hearing is more people are saying they're sensitive to small amounts of gluten and they can get ill for days. And then we talked, Jocelyn, we were just mentioning about the quality of life. This uncertainty about labeling is causing significant frustration and anxiety, resulting in a decreased quality of life. So it is not as simple, just eliminate bread and pasta and you're good to go. And then, as Jackie was talking about, people commented how incredibly frustrated they were with the terms gluten-friendly, gluten-wise, gluten-aware, and they want regulations for restaurant food, and they want more training and knowledge of our food service staff, and not just restaurants, but the institutions and other establishments. And I think that's a goal for us at the CCA. We need to continue to work in the food service area. And just to let you know, Tricia Thompson with Gluten Free Watchdog just submitted something to the FDA about examples of how gluten-free or how foods are being promoted in restaurants for gluten-free. And this is the last couple slides here. I was in the hospital in a cafeteria, and you can see it says gluten on the top one. The Thai chicken salad is gluten aware, and then the other one is gluten-free sandwiches contain gluten-free bread, but it's not prepared in a controlled environment. So what do you do with that? And that's a hospital. And all the more why we need to support the gluten-free food program that Jackie talked about from the CCA, the gluten-free verified and the gluten-free dedicated. So in summary then, the bottom line, what people are saying is our health depends on consistent, clear, and not misleading labeling. We do not want Health Canada to allow, may contain, and other precautionary statements on products that have a gluten-free claim. They want stricter regulations for the use of may contains and other precautionary statements, and they want to see more products with gluten-free claims and or certified. So that is a summary of everything you needed to know about labeling in about 35, 40 minutes. A tough one, but I think it gives us lots of good information that we can take to Health Canada, that we can work on from education. And thank you for all of those that did participate in the survey. And so there's lots of fodder for questions and answers after, but I'm going to turn it over to Ines to tell us some more hot topics. Thank you.
Overwhelming, fantastic information. Thanks, Shelley. It, I think, speaks and highlights to even the dietetic profession and how difficult and challenging it can be to do these teachings. Having said that, I very much appreciate the CCA for allowing me to speak today, and I very much want to thank the patients that I work with and the families that support them, because without them, I wouldn't have learned so much of what I refer to as the gluten-free treatment for celiac disease. I am called a dietitian. I hate the word diet, and I especially don't like the term gluten-free diet because I think it implies that there's a lot more flexibility than there really is, and there's a lot more that we can learn about the gluten-free therapy. So on the theme of hot topics, I have about 3 billion that I wanted to bring to the table today, and of course I limited it to 2 after discussing with my colleagues. And in particular, one of the common themes that parents and guardians ask me about is referring to the nutritional adequacy of the gluten-free diet. Do I get to play with this? Oh, wow, okay. Oh, no, that's a pointer. The big green button. Okay, very good. All right. So there might be some concepts that I'll review with all of you in the room today that is already known, but I think what the idea is to take these hot topics and to share them, advocate, learn more, expand on research, get resources to do better, ultimately. So on the topic of nutritional adequacy, one of the biggest concerns and what research is telling us about, and I'm going to be really, really quick here, is we know that the gluten-free diet is often touted and advertised as being, quote, healthier. However, if you look at the nutritional content of gluten-free versus gluten-containing foods, we know that in order to make these foods more palatable, in order for it to have the structure that it needs, the texture that it needs, you have to add nutrients back in when you remove gluten. So you add fat, you add carbohydrate, thereby increasing the caloric density of that particular food. So compared to gluten-containing products, a lot of gluten-free products actually have more calories in them per same unit serving, and they are often lower in fiber. And this has been well studied. In addition to that, one of the things that we certainly know about is that there's also less protein. So not as it just relates to children, but as it relates to adults, we want to ensure that anybody who has celiac disease and is following a strict gluten-free diet, that you are getting the optimal nutrition you possibly can. And unfortunately, if you look at the studies here that I've listed for you, that's not possible on a strict gluten-free diet. Oh, big green button. Okay, so we talk about if you want to improve the nutritional adequacy, well, what do? We eat more vegetables and fruits, right? That's just a common thing. Dietitians say it to everyone. It's super easy to do, right? Not at all. So we look at Canada's new food guide to healthy eating. We look at different handouts and resources. We look to dietitians. We look to other nutrition experts. But one thing that I can say wholeheartedly, and I feel that this isn't just in pediatrics, when you look at what people are actually eating, they're not eating well. And of what it is that they are eating, starches and grains make up a large proportion of the diet of Canadians. So these several studies that I have outlined here actually took the Canadian Community Health Survey of 2015 and looked at the consumption patterns of what Canadians are actually eating. And for any Canadian greater than 2 years of age, you see here that grains and starches make up about 30% of the whole diet. So I'm not talking about carbohydrates, I'm just talking about starches and grains, and that's a significant amount. And so when we're talking about actually where there might be some gaps there, which is my segue, and I'm trying to do this really quickly, so bear with me, into the next slide is, okay, so we eat a lot of grains in Canada. We eat a lot of starches in Canada, okay? So Shelley's gone through this. I'm sure all of you in the room here are aware of what are gluten-containing versus gluten-free grains. All right, so we've talked about wheat, we've talked about labeling, we've talked about oats, so I'm going to move forward. All in the interest of time, because really what I want is a lot of discussion, a lot of interaction, having ideas of how we can advocate more here. But one of the things that is hugely flawed in my opinion, and those of probably others, is that gluten-free grain flours are not fortified, they are not enriched. And when we talk about enrichments and we're talking about nutrients, so wheat is, not so bad. Wheat is fortified in Canada. It is fortified and it's identified there for you. It's probably a little bit small, but what are the mandated nutrients? Okay, and what are the nutrients that, the B vitamins, the folate, the iron, the protein? So what's mandated versus what is potential maybe. So if I just said to you in the previous slide that we as Canadians eat a lot of grains and grain flours, if you go on a gluten-free diet, somebody fill in the blank here, these flours aren't enriched in Canada, what are people with celiac disease missing? A lot of significant nutrients. Huge concern. And again, I say this not just in infants, children, or teenagers, which I work with, but anyone who is strictly gluten-free for celiac disease. Now, my other hot topic. This one's a really hot one, and I don't know how many of you are aware of how hot this topic is, but CBC Marketplace just aired a great special about arsenic and arsenic in the food supply, okay? So, this is one case report that I took out of a literature review, and just to highlight we do know that arsenic exposure is currently a health concern. It is associated with cancers, it's associated with cardiovascular disease, it's associated with immunological deficiencies, and this is a case of a woman who was defined as being poisoned secondary to arson exposure, and the medical team that looked after her concluded that based on the environment that she's from, so this wasn't contaminated water, but she has celiac disease, strictly gluten-free, and that the poisoning was likely related to an overexposure of arsenic because her diet was very rich in rice and rice-based products. Now, for parents or guardians of infants and children who are still developing brain development, growth, and whatnot, I get asked this question multiple times every week. How much arsenic is too much? And what should I feed my child who has to be strictly gluten-free when all of the products that are available that my child's willing to eat are primarily rice-based, and I'm now worried about arsenic poisoning? And I use that word not lightly, but this is what families are asking me. They're asking me about poisoning, and I really don't know where to guide them. So, how do I go back? Back. Yeah, right. Siri, go back. Okay. So if we talk about arsenic consumption, this is kind of sort of the thread and the chain. So gluten-free products often do contain rice or some rice-based product. We do see that, particularly, I can say, for children. A lot of snack products contain rice. Rice milk's quite popular now, too, because apparently moo juice is not good for you either, according to, Goop and some other, Dr. Google and other very knowledgeable resources. So we go through this line of kind of sort of thinking, and very good. And we say to ourselves, well, what is it? That's a problem. Is it really a concern? I can tell you that there is a plethora of research out there looking at this, and that there's something we absolutely need to do about this. We need to start getting food industry to look into arsenic, how much is out there, what are we being exposed to. We need better understanding of what's toxic and what's safe. That also needs to be identified across the age spans, and we need to disclose it. Us as consumers, not just us as clinicians, need to know what it is that we are encouraging people to consume and or what effects there are. So I am advocating here for all of us to learn more about arsenic exposure and what that means to people with celiac disease. In the meantime, though, what do I tell my families? I don't want to leave them with nothing, so I have to give them with some recommendations, which is try to eat a wide variety of foods, not just your rice-based products that are rich. Cook your rice with a lot more water, boil it a lot more, drain that excess. Do a little bit of combinations. You can do a rice quinoa mix. It's quite tasty, and if you fry it, right, anything fried is delicious. And then just consider avoiding certain rice products, as we know that those are generally higher in arsenic. Thank you to Tricia at Gluten Free Watchdog, who's done a lot of really good work on this. Without her data, it makes it difficult for me to do my job. And also thank you to my colleagues throughout Canada. Shout out to Jessica, Diana Major, the gluten-free food guide that might be coming out soon to look at the variety, and things that we can do to improve gluten-free therapy for people with celiac disease. Thanks.